Good morning, and welcome. This is the live event where we're talking about the four pillars of self mastery. This is foundational to dynamic leadership, and it's aligned with the first two pillars of emotional intelligence, self awareness, and self management. And this is not to compete with emotional intelligence. The point is, emotional intelligence was formed or developed and created in the mid 90s, and neuroscience was not far enough along to know some of the things that we know now. I often say to know and not do is to not know, and there's a lot of information out there, and it's exploding with artificial intelligence being able to organize it, group it, communicate it, spin it, etc. And the challenge that we have is you can add all this information and knowledge. It doesn't necessarily equal wisdom, but until you do it, you really can't say that you fully know it. And that's why I make that distinction. Because the emotional intelligence work was developed before we had the understanding of the network of neurons, is what we thought was the subconscious, and the conscious mind obviously is the conscious mind. But when you step away from thinking of the network of neurons as a mind, things change, because the network of neurons gives us signals that we act on. Those signals come across and we think of them as truth because we think they came from, well, they did come from us, but we're thinking that they're coming from our conscious self or some form of our conscious self. Subconscious is below, but it's not a mind. And so the network of neurons, understanding that. And so when I break it down into all these different steps, the objective is not to try to remember all of this. The objective is to find simplicity on the other side of complexity. So, and I'll walk through that a little bit today. But when I get to the seven phases of the 1 second model, that's the stimulus response. First of all, if you go back 20 or 30 years, who knew that we were doing thousands and thousands, 30,000 response cycles a day? Who knew that those stimulus response cycles were actually network of neural pathways with energy flowing through them, creating a signal that's then perceived by the conscious mind? So when you start looking at it that way, you recognize that a person's personality is made up of their behaviors. Their behaviors are habitual, and while their behaviors are not who they are, their personality is a result of their behaviors. So if you want to change your personality, you don't change it at the summary or the construct level. You change the personality at the elements level. So you find out what are the big elements that make big changes, and then you just start working away the same way that you would do with an athlete if you were trying to get them to change the way they pull or the way they pivot. If you need to change that, you don't change it at the macro level, you change it at the micro, at the elements level, by working on the different parts of the exercise. So when we talk about identity shifts, that's like personality. Identity is a construct. To change your identity at the identity level, this is why people have imposter syndrome. They think they're not enough, it's not available to them. And here's the other thing that makes it more difficult is that they can change it, and on a good day of a good week it works, but under pressure it doesn't. And that's because the network of neurons is constantly making associations. You've heard the neurons that fire together wire together, constantly making new associations, constantly recruiting others when there's concerns or there's fear or stress. And that process is one of the reasons why these solutions seem to come and go, which is why I break it down. Once you understand it, you're able to manage it, and it's not something that happens in a day or a week. But it also doesn't take years. I say you need to give it a few months because you have to build the habits of the new automaticity. But it doesn't take years, and most people who are have some experience, 10, 20, 30 years experience in business, know that they have habits that they've been working on for that entire time. And so I say that the time is going to pass anyway. And you haven't tried everything until you've tried everything, and everything is continuing to expand. So we have to be able to take a look and say, okay, what is new about this? I used to go to seminars. I still do, but I used to go to a lot of seminars, and my thought was, I just need to get one idea, because most of what I was hearing, this is before the internet, most of what I was hearing, I had already heard before. It was maybe a different spin, but then there always would be one or two things that come out of it. So I would sit for 8 hours knowing that I would get at least 30 minutes worth of quality information. But that information, because of my experience, I could apply it. And that's the how this evolved, what I'm doing now. It's taking all that information and then putting it through a filter of what's going on with neuroscience and what's going on with the brain, and what are the obstacles and all that. That's why I break it out like I do, because I need to be able to explain it. And then once we get it, I always collapse it back. So when I'm working with the client, we don't talk about the 7 steps. We don't talk about the 7 performance areas. We don't talk about the 7 phases of the 1 second model. We just talk about the language that's pertinent to that person at that time in that moment. And it's basically all about performance. It's all about high performance. And maybe you need to slow it down, but slow it down means a lot of different things. Now, what I want to do first is get us oriented onto what I'm doing here today. Now, we have the 7 step reset. Conditioning, dashboard, reset, regulate, making sure we're regulated, conditioned reaction, and this is the response. And I make sure I separate those two, because the reaction from the network of neurons is really just a recommendation, and we need to discount that. Now, in an operational environment, when you're doing the same thing over and over, day in and day out, that recommendation is probably more often the exact thing you need to do. But when you're working on a project, creating a solution, the Einstein used to say the level of thinking that got you into a problem is inadequate to get you out of the problem. So whenever you're solving a problem, a complex problem, you are in the field of infinite possibilities, and it takes iterative work to be able to figure out what's the right solution. So your past associations are usually not useful when it comes to major project work. These you can point back to this when you think about what are some of the big problems. Why are projects so hard? Why do projects have overruns? Why do some organizations consistently have projects that are late and have to repeat, or they have project overruns, or the last third, 1/3 of the project time is always so complex and difficult, and mistakes are made. All of that can be pointed back to how the person starts. And if you do this one thing, if you do nothing else that I say, and you do this one thing as a business owner, as a leader, you separate operational work from project work. Project work requires a different thought process and a different approach, because you have to clearly define the problem. You have to come up with different solutions. You have to do a lot more testing, because you don't know. And anyone who's doing advertising, marketing in this day and age, especially with artificial intelligence, you could stay in the lab all you want, but you won't know how that ad copy is going to work until you get it out in front of people. So you have to do iterative, much, much more so than in the past. But if you do that one thing, separate operations from project, and recognize that projects are going to take a lot longer. Projects need effectiveness, whereas operations focus on efficiency. Projects need new thinking, whereas efficiency or operations needs experience, people who have experience doing that thing. Projects require big picture thinking and being able to relate the normally unrelated. Projects require more testing. Operations require a knowledge of the system, right? Because that way you can design it and you go. And sometimes you have a hiccup, but when you apply operations thinking to project work, you're going to have problems. And the reason this happens so often is because the people who get promoted are operationally proficient. They get results, and to get results day in and day out is an operational process. Then you have to have an innovation, which means you need a project, and we naturally put those same operational people in charge of the project. So what you can do as a business owner, if you don't have enough people, which is often the case, you can have some of your high potential people trained in project work and then let them be the project manager, but treat it like a general manager. And then you can hire people from Upwork or a freelance site and have them come in and help out. Or you can create, if your organization is big enough, you can create teams from those operational areas and they work on the project. But I do think as a business owner, you do want to make sure you have a few people developed in project work, or you can outsource it. There's enough outsourcing organizations that you can easily outsource the project work. There's some friction there that you have. There's a learning curve and all that. But when you have projects that have 2 and 3x overruns and 2 and 3x cost, time and cost overruns, it's a small price to pay. Pay now or pay later, right? So these are the steps. This is what we're doing today. Steps 3 and 4. We're going from the handoff, which is a recommendation, to the for the response. This is a response. This is emotional modulation. This is action, and this is presence. Return to presence or mindfulness. And this was conditioning, and this is regulated. So you want to keep upgrading your conditioning. This is your development. This is your being regulated so that you are ready for this next one. Remember, this is happening thousands of times a day. And then we have the recommendation to the response, and then your emotional modulation if you need it. You don't always need emotional modulation, and this could be anywhere from a second to 90 seconds. As the better you get with this process, more experience you get with this process, the faster this will go. And also, the more you do these things over here, work on the regulation, work on the what we talked about the other day, positivity, the first part of step 3, and then you're going to have fewer and fewer times where you need emotional modulation. And then the action is do it, delay it, delegate it, or discard it. And then you have return to presence. And this, of course, this action step could turn into a project plan. You're not going to be doing a project plan every single stimulus and response cycle, but the point is you want to get through this and then back to regulate it for the next one. And today, this handoff, we're going to call the autopilot. We're not replacing it, we are upgrading it. So I'm going to stop there and we'll take a look at just to get us on the same page here. So the 4 pillars of self mastery is what I did last week, and then this week, or 2 weeks ago, and this week and last, I'm looking at the levers and actions that we can use to command the 4 pillars. When you think about changing habits, it's at the higher level, it's cue and response, but it's so much more complex than that. There's many places for it to fall off. We have 100 billion neurons, each interacting with thousands of other neurons. We have trillions and trillions of connections. And this is why it's so difficult. It seems so difficult, but when you understand what's going on and you go to the source, it's a lot easier. It's almost like if you had rabbits proliferating an area and you spent all your time trying to take the rabbits out of that area, you're fighting a losing battle. If you go way upstream and find out where the rabbits are being birthed and you take that and move it to where you want the rabbits, you've solved the problem. And that's what we're doing with this. Again, I mentioned it's aligned with emotional intelligence, and I like emotional intelligence. I think it's done a wonderful thing for leadership. And what dynamic leadership does is it takes the some of what emotional intelligence tells us and makes it actionable. Emotional intelligence didn't get created out of a vacuum. Emotional intelligence was created because what we know from self determination theory, there are ways that you can lead that create intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic, and we know the intrinsic motivation is much more powerful. And you have relationship building and these other factors, and so emotional intelligence was another stepping stone to make self determination theory, autonomy, competence, relatedness, to take that and package it into a way that can be trained for leaders. And now, what I'm doing with the dynamic leadership is taking the best of emotional intelligence, the best of the autonomy, competence, relatedness, and looking at that together and then applying it to real world, what really matters. And a big difference that between what I'm doing with dynamic leadership and what I would say most other leadership programs is that I am focusing on principles. What do I mean? In I've been in different many organizations, and some organizations I've reported to, two or three different people in a year. So I've seen a lot of different styles. I've built high performing teams. I was airborne ranger, so you saw how that process worked. You can see how we take young soldiers from not knowing to doing and executing and ready for combat in 8 weeks. Frontline special ops type combat. Now, of course, they get better and better with training, but they could function within 8 weeks. So then why is it that we take so long with business? I look at it as, excuse me, if you look at a team, a sports team, and you look at the difference between a high school team and a professional team, there's one thing that stands out. The high school teams can get away with trick plays. The high school teams can get away with sloppily executed plays because the athleticism of the best is so much better than the average, and they can rely on that athleticism. By the time you get to the pros, you don't see the trick plays because there's too much athleticism and there's too much experience, so the trick plays don't work. And how do we know the trick plays don't work? Because professional sports teams are hyper about metrics and stats, and they're not going to do something that has a low percentage. You see a lot of plays. I remember growing up watching football and wondering why the coach doesn't do this or why wouldn't they go for it? It's only 2 or 3 yards. They should go for the fourth down or instead of. But you look at the stats. The stats say that the better play is to punt it. Now, as you get down to a yard, then maybe they'll go for it. But even I've seen many games where it's a yard and they wouldn't go for it because of the stats. My point is this: when you have someone in your face every week trying to stop every single play, you only do the best. Now, right? Think about that. And in lacrosse and basketball and hockey and they call it like face guarding. If you have a person on you all the time, only the best things are going to work. And business doesn't have that. We may have competitors, but we don't have somebody trying to stop every single play. Now there might be exceptions out there. And because of that, we're able to go with what feels good, what's most popular, what the most persuasive person shared with us, what the loudest voice gave us. So now you have an organization with different leaders who are all strong in their own right, but their strength is different. One person might be relationship building, another person might be charisma, another person might be just their experience or their command of the information. Another one might be they treat everybody like a family, and it may all work, but now you have multiple metaphors inside your organization and you're trying to build a high performing team. It doesn't work because as people move from one team to the other, or when people are sitting around talking or you people hanging out, they find out that their experience is different from somebody else's day-to-day experience, and you could get toxicity in the workplace. That's not the only way to get toxicity, but the point is if you get toxicity in the workplace, you're not going to have the high performance. And I'm not saying conflict. It's okay to have some conflict. You have to have a some kind of a debate, some kind of discussion to get to the best solution. Everything is interdependent, so you can't just say we're doing it this way, my way or the highway. It's more like win-win or no deal. What we advocate with dynamic leadership is to have one type of one metaphor, and that would be team, because then you have models for high performance. And the way you decide what works is you use principles, because principles and near principles, because you don't have somebody in your face every day to or every week to put numbers up on a scoreboard to tell you what works and what doesn't work. So we have to come up with that. And rather than use persuasion and get influenced by cognitive biases and the person who has the loudest voice, etc., we're going to use principles. And the principles that I suggest for my clients is there's three books that I really like, because they the amount of research that was done. These books were written not because somebody wanted to write a book. These books were the result of extensive research. So two of them, Good to Great and Great by Choice by Jim Collins. The way he did his data, looking at companies, and they were public companies, so he was able to collect data for way back, and then he looked at them making an inflection point, and the only ones that made the cut for Good to Great is they had to not only inflect and make this above average result, but they had to do it for at least 15 years. And then with Great by Choice, after the 2008 financial recession, he then looked at those good to great companies and looked at the ones that didn't fall off. Now, the ones that kept going, he looked at what was different between those and the others. So now you have all this data that says these, over time, these are the things that work, these are the things that don't. And I'm not listening to the loudest voice. I'm going to go back to the data. So that's what I recommend. Good to Great, Great by Choice, and then you pull the principles out of those books. And then the other book I like is Multipliers, because again, tons of research with this. Liz Weissman, is this Liz Susan Weissman? Liz Weissman, I think it is, the author. The amount of research that went into that, deep research, to identify what are the multiplier behaviors and what are the diminisher behaviors. So now you have two sources, Jim Collins and this Weissman, that you can look at and say, okay, these are the things that years and years of testing have proven. And then the third book I like to add into that mix is Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Again, while he didn't do it wasn't the same type of research, it was definitely research, and he was working with organizations at the executive level as he was formulating these seven habits. And so again, you have principles that you can follow. So when it comes to relationships, it comes to managing yourself, managing other, interacting with others, etc., that's a good place to start. Why argue about whether or not we should seek first to understand before being understood? It's supported by virtually everything written about communications. But if you just follow the seven habits, you're going to be in a better place than if you're doing trial and error. Now, once you take the principles, then you could go into your iterative development and iterative refinement, because you're going with principles and you don't have to wonder about those. It reminds me, like when I was doing motorcycle racing, one of the things I appreciated doing was being able to race in a class where the bikes were the same, because then you could realize where my skill is. I could realize where my skill is deficient versus thinking it might be something with the motorcycle. So the same thing with ski. When I'm out skiing, if I'm working on something, I want to get a ski that that I know I can do X, Y, and Z, and or that I know other people can do X, Y, and Z, and then it helps me focus on identifying exactly where I can improve. Maybe out of scope for this conversation, but the point is we want to use principles and we want to stabilize some of the variables so we're working on the right things. And that's why I paused on this slide with emotional intelligence. I'm not taking anything away from emotional intelligence. I'm not trying to replace it. We want to use it, but we want to make it actionable. So you can take everything you know with emotional intelligence and overlay some of this work with a self mastery, and you'll see that it's a way to action on the best practices from emotional intelligence. And then there's my 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual is in our control. Emotional is also in our control, but I call it the gateway, because this is the also the window to being hijacked. If a person gets hijacked, they can do everything right here, but they get hijacked over here, and next thing you know, they're 2 steps back. So we need to make sure that this works on a bad day of a bad week. We need to make sure that the person can do this even in the midst of all chaos. And then we start working on the quest. And these are the elements of the quest: relationships, professional, and financial. And they'll, as you work on them, they'll uncover weak links, because remember, we're going above the line. We're into the field of infinite possibility. So you're going to find some weak links, but now we have the skills to do it. And this is why I focus so much on habits, because you can't go with the habits that were formed from 0 to 7. You'll just keep creating more. Your tomorrows will be just like your yesterdays. But once you have that self mastery and are able to master habit change, then you can upgrade this over here. You get a handle on this over here, and then you apply it here. But now this is real world and it's iterative, and reacting, but you're reacting from a place of being regulated, not from a place of being stressed. And that's aligned with emotional intelligence. In fact, emotional intelligence says self awareness and self management, which is happening over here, and then social awareness, which is happening here, and relationship management, which is this whole side. I didn't think about that when I created this. I created this from scratch, just trial and error, looking at 12 and 6, and just juggling them and juggling them. It turns out it also lines up with be, do, have, so it lines up with everything. I spent 2 years just juggling this and playing with it and seeing if I move this one, what happens? If I move that one, what happens? So I feel real good about that. And as I said, it's aligned with emotional intelligence, and it's aligned and it's foundational for dynamic leadership. And the thing is, when I'm working with the client, we don't have to deal with 7 of these. You just either talk about, did you get triggered? Were you stressed? So what would you have done if you had thought about it? What kept you? We just go right into the heart of it, but we already know the common language. And that's also why group coaching makes it work for group coaching, because I spend a year with people afterwards doing the group coaching, and all you need is an insight, and it puts you back into, oh yeah, I'll do it that way. Now this is the 7-step reset. Now again, I break everything down so we can get to simplicity on the other side of complexity. This is where we're working today. We're going from the conditioned reaction to handoff to the response. And then we'll keep working through this. So tomorrow I'll spend a little more time between 4 and 8. I won't spend a lot of time on emotional modulation because we already did that. But assuming that the emotions are in check, we'll go 4 and then 6. And 7 is an easy conversation once you have all this lined up. And here's the 7 phases of the 1 second model, not to be confused with the 7-step reset. This is just step 3. This picture is just step 3. And on the other side of this, we have the autopilot recommendation. So after this, we get a recommendation to the response. The pre-listening, initial detection, rapid appraisal, reaction formation, this is all happening in the network of neurons. And then this preconscious surfacing, this is when the network of neurons is changing from a signal, an energy that goes to the neural pathways, that creates a signal. And that signal is then recomposed or converted into a thought that can be perceived by the conscious mind. And that's the reaction. It's important. And I put this space here because it's so easy to fall into the trap of letting our reaction equal our response. That's why I separate them out. If the reaction equals the response, you're doing what worked in the past. So we have this space in here to separate the handoff. Now, if you just look at it from math, this side is processing at 11 million bits per second. The conscious mind side, way over here, processes at only 50 bits per second. We want to slow things down. So this here is anywhere from a quarter to a half second. What I advocate is we're going to add about a quarter of a second to this, maybe a half second in some cases, but add a quarter of a second to this entire model. That brings us up to the 1 second. Because normally this could be done in a half second to 3/4 of a second. We're going to add a quarter of a second. So now it brings up to the whole second. And that's before the handoff. So what I'd like to think about it is we're going to, if you're a plane landing in an airfield that you're not familiar with, you're not just going to go in and land. You're going to circle. I'm talking about a field like where the pilots are landing on grass fields and there's no tower, etc. they're going to circle, make sure they see everything down there. They look at the field before they land. If you just come in and land, over time, you're going to get caught by something that you didn't see. So we'll come back to that. So what I'm talking about today is I use the term automaticity. So we already talked about positivity and emotional modulation. So we're creating some automaticity there to aid with prevention. And now what I'll talk about is automaticity that's inside the 1 second model. So in the 1 second model, to simplify it, in fact, you know what I'll do? We will take this slide and see if I combine it here. And then if I take this, there we go. So you can see now side by side, to simplify it, because there are things, the reason I have 7 phases, there are things that happen here that we can do. There are things that happen here that we can do. There are things that happen between this and this we can do. There are things that happen here we can do. Things that we can happen here that happen here. So I had to break this out to be able to understand it. Otherwise, it's all just stimulus response. So to simplify this, what I'll do is create the left side and the right side. So this is network of neurons, and this is conscious mind. Okay. What we're doing is working in this area. This area is like the autopilot. And the objective, if we have step 4 over here, you have step 4 over here. I'll make that a different color. And this is the response. What I'm suggesting is that if we do an intervention between the normal, the automaticity, the autopilot. Let me back up. I said that wrong. This is not the conscious mind. This is the conscious mind. This is the transition. So the transition, when people would think about the transition, they might only be thinking about this like a millisecond, a couple of milliseconds. It goes from here to here. I've broken this transition out. And in fact, I'm going to change this label to transition because it's not really the conscious mind. This is all pre-conscious. And then the handoff goes to the conscious mind. And that conscious mind is where we have the 50 bits per second. This is where we have still 11 million bits per second. But in practice, the way you experience this whole thing is happening in a quarter of a second because you got a reaction time over here of a quarter of a second. So you don't even know what's going on. And then another quarter of a second for this conscious mind to come online. And then most people are rushing. And that's where we want to spend the time. Most people are rushing to get through this because they want to get to the response. And we're going to change the autopilot from efficiency to effectiveness. And all this stuff is like motherhood and apple pie, but it's not been talked about in the context of making it actionable for changing habits. We're going to go from fast as the priority to accurate. We're going to go from good to precise. Uh, Before I got to this part, there's a book called MacGyver Method, and he this is the guy who wrote the TV, was the writer for the TV series MacGyver. And MacGyver, the main character, would get into, he's like a private investigator or something like that, but he would get into these situations that were very challenging and there was a threat. And he would work his way out with just gadgets from around. He would just create these solutions. And people liked it because he didn't know where it was coming from. It was all new and it tapped into our desire for what's going to happen. And it was great. It's great series that ran. He said that what he used to do when he would have to write the show, he would set the scenario, set up the problem, and then hand it off to his subconscious. Now, this was done before we understood that the subconscious is actually a network of neurons and not a mind, but it still works. It's called attentional priming. And what he would do is hand off to the subconscious a set of instructions and say, here's my problem. I need a solution for this that meets these criteria. It's almost like a prompt that you're doing with artificial intelligence. And then he would say, I'm going to come back to you at 7 o'clock tonight. And for the response, and he would go away and do something completely different. This is called an incubation, direct incubation period, where you're letting the subconscious work on something on your behalf in the background, and that incubation would produce a result. And he wrote that show for I don't know how many years using that approach, and it would come up with the solution. And it may not have always been perfect. I don't, I read the book. I don't remember the exact details if there were iterations or whatever. But the point is he would be able to get that result. So I said, well, if you could do this over a few hours, why can't you do it in less than a second over here? And turns out there's a thing. And we're going to call it, for this purpose, we're going to call it autopilot. And instead of being hours with the attentional priming, the incubation, and because it's working on a bigger problem, when MacGyver was doing it, he was working on a bigger problem. So we're going to call this space the autopilot. He was working on a bigger problem. It needed more work on the solution. But here, all we want to do is hand off something better than just, here's my recommendation. Because remember, this pre listening, it's through a lens of the past, and it may be perceiving threats that are not there. Now, once you start doing the positivity exercise, once you're more regulated, this pre listening is going to be more aligned with reality and more aligned with your vision or quest. The initial detection, your cognitive biases, that gets in the way. Then you have the path of least resistance with the rapid appraisal. And this reaction is coming out of here. It's all based on speed. And the reaction is something that worked in the past. This is why you see some teams, when they have a new project or new outcome they need, they go right back to what they did the last time and they start with that. And it's like, it, it's not good if you're innovating. If you're doing something that's breakthrough and going and starting with what you did before, it just doesn't work, not long term. And this is all about speed. Every in here, this is what we learned from a kid in school. We learn speed. If you, I was teaching kids at church, doing stories to teach the Bible using stories, and I would teach these. I have a room of 70 kids, 7 and 8 year olds, and you ask a question and the hands all shoot up. Everybody's trying to get the hand up first, and you call on somebody and they look at you and they have no idea about the answer. They weren't even paying attention. They just heard this, who wants to answer this question or something like that, or who knows what this means. And these hands would go up and you say, okay, what does it mean? And they look at you like, and it's because they were just rushing. I would say that that led to this where we are now, and it's also reinforced early in the work. The person who's fast when you're at the operational level before the promotion start happening. It's like the person who does it fast gets rewarded. They get acknowledged, and so we get into the speed thing, and we're conditioned that everything is speed. So what we're going to do is recondition it to be slower, to slow down, and not just slow down, but to give the network of neurons some instructions so that what it hands off to the as the recommendation is actually a synthesized bit of information that empowers the response to be more effective, more aligned, more appropriate. When I first started, my the way I conditioned my handoff was the first step of problem solving, clearly define the problem. And then I expanded it to no cost solution and an ideal solution. So I, when I get hit with a problem, I want my network of neurons processing, because it processes so fast. I want it to come up with what is the what's a clear definition of this problem and what are possible solutions. So in doing research, you find out that some of this has already been done in the labs with neuroscientists, and you what you're going to do. Let me go to the slide now that I've made that point, because let me we're going to do, if you think about the conversation in these terms, we're going effectiveness, effectiveness versus efficiency. And this is not either or. In this case, it's sequence. We want effectiveness first, effect and efficiency second. So you might go effectiveness, and then you bring in the efficiency. Effectiveness, and then you bring in the efficiency. But we don't want to just go after efficiency first because you give up too much. So that's that one. I already said fast versus accurate. And you can do many of these, right? You can do profit and growth. You can do the what and the how. That's a good one to separate those, because you're trying to figure out what you want to do. At the same time, you're thinking about how. You trip over yourself. And you also start filtering the what's by the amount of work that you perceive is going to be required. And so you don't want to look at them at the same time. It's you, by separating them, you gain insight. And we want to have a good balance. If you just focus on the what and you don't focus on the how, you get results, but you may also get corruption, or you may get shortcuts, or you may get people falsifying documents and reports on the bad side. Uh, If you focus all on the how, you never get to the what. So you would need to do both. And you can set up your handoff in here to move this along. So your recommendation that comes out of here to the conscious mind is more aligned with what you want to do. And I'll pull up a slide. We'll go here. So this is the upgrade the autopilot, the 7 elements of a well-framed problem. So this is an example of what MacGyver would have done. The outcome, what you want, and then a single sentence that defines the win. I need a believable way for MacGyver to escape the room. Correct context, where, when, and who. Just enough context to prevent irrelevant solutions. You can read that. I'll just do a screenshot of that, and then you can see the example. So this is not in business terminology. This is from MacGyver. Here's the example if we look at it from business. So you have, let's see, we want to stop sharing. I don't know if I can get this focused better than that. So let's try. Oh, so outcome, what do you want? So business example, a 30-day plan to stabilize churn in our mid-market segment. Communication example, a message that resets expectations without damaging trust. And then relationship example, a repair conversation that rebuilds alignment and respect. Then you have context, where, who, what, and when. And then you have the constraints, rules of the game, no new hires for 60 days, must use current tooling, communication, no blame language, must be clear. You can see that that would work. Prime Primary obstacle, what's blocking the win? Customers don't reach time to value before week 2. Communication defensiveness triggers escalation on both sides. This is sort of how you would frame attentional priming. But what I'm talking about now is not intentional priming. This is where you're going to use incubation and walk away for a couple of hours. What we're going to talk about is the autopilot, upgrading the autopilot. And with upgrading the autopilot, so now we have elements of upgrading the autopilot from fast and familiar to accurate and aligned. And you can go ahead and take a screenshot of that one. And there's 2 parts on here. So over here we have the elements. So it's the same setup. You want to have the right signal and the observable behavior that you're going to use, the old pattern behavior to set up the old, and then you need the new the replacement pattern. And so this is where I used clearly define the problem and what are possible solutions. And this one is a clear precision first or effectiveness first behavior. And then over here you have the mechanism. So when we have to talk about the swish pattern, but basically the swish pattern is something that happens very early in the initial detection and rapid appraisal stage, where we're swishing out the old behavior and swishing in a new behavior. You can actually look up swish pattern and you'll probably get something on that. But you can swish it. That's one thing you can do. But a swish, what it does is it makes you aware. So for example, when I'm helping a person get rid of their or stop saying ums, I'll use the swish pattern typically. And the swish pattern, you have a picture of what you don't want. In this case, it would be the ums, and it would be from first person. So they're seeing the environment through the eyes. So they're speaking for a group, or they're speaking to another person, or they're speaking into a camera, and they see themselves, imagine themselves starting to say and as that is coming out, we immediately switch the picture, and that picture, that associated picture, gets swished with a dissociated picture. So instead of being through their own eyes, you now see them over there being successful, or maybe you see a standing ovation if they're speaking, you see the room, and that blows up the other one. So it's almost like you have the one picture and it starts a very small in the picture and it blows up, and that's why you say whoosh, and that's why they call it a swish pattern, because you make the sound whoosh, and that whoosh is to bring in another sense. So you have the visual and then you have the auditory, and that swish pattern, it's a very, very good tool to make you aware that you're about to say people think it's going to change the habit. Sometimes it changes the habit. If there's enough motivation, the habit will change. But oftentimes, it's awareness is what's noticed first. And I like to think of that as it's showing you the door, it's even opening the door, but you have to go through the door. So we can do that with the old behavior and the new behavior or desired behavior. So this is now you're literally swishing into your autopilot. You're getting your autopilot to ask the questions. In my case, I was using clearly define the problem and what are some possible solutions. But it's other things that you can do. You can have, so essentially the model is you define what is it that you want, give two options, and then come up with a recommendation. And that recommendation is happening at the network of neurons level to hand off to the conscious mind. This is the beauty of this, is that you're using the automaticity of the you're using the automaticity of the habit structure to help move the ball along aligned with our quest. So I used fast, accurate, effectiveness, and efficiency. So maybe that you have defined what it is. We're hit with the breakdown. Something's going wrong with the system, the business system, and the that's the definition. Then what are two options? A low cost solution and an ideal solution. And then, or maybe it's ask a clarifying question. Maybe that could be the next step, or it could be ask for additional information. It could be going straight to an effective solution, or like I was saying, what's an ideal solution and a low cost or no cost solution, and then the last step would be the recommendation. So the idea is you're swishing in this new pattern, and you still have to go through the door. You still have to do it. And that's where the next part of this gets into, it's you practice. So the swish is one thing, the practice is the other. So now you're going to imagine, and we already talked about the positivity exercise. You're going to do that 3 times a day for 6 weeks. You can do the same thing here. It's not going to take you 6 weeks. If you just visualize, you can do this during your meditation. Just visualize something coming in and then swish in. I wouldn't go overboard. I would say start with one or two prompts that you're going to use. I use the clearly define the problem and come up with two solutions. That's enough of a habit to build. Once the habit gets in place, what you'll find is that the pause is already there, and it's a lot easier to get context specific once you have the habit. So we're doing two things. We're first building the habit to have this space, and then after we build the habit to have that space, that's like a container that says I'm going to define what I'm seeing. I'm going to, this is the network of neurons, define what we're seeing, come up with two options, and then come up with a recommendation. And once that space is there, it's a lot easier to put other things into the container. So then you'll find yourself, because the habit system is already there. The dopamine is going to make you do more of what works well and less of what doesn't. So once you get the space there and you've got the initial habit started, it's going to be easier for you to upgrade it from there. So that was the you can read the book The MacGyver Method to get the idea at the big picture level, and then what we were just talking about is how do you condense that down into How do you condense it down into an immediacy where it happens in that 1 second model? That's the point. So I don't want to have my response from the conscious mind to equal my reaction. I want my thinking to be involved, and that's what this pause does. Now, you've heard people talk about, oh, you have to pause before you respond. It's too late. Once that speed is through, and you're at that point of the consolidation and ready to hand off to the conscious mind, it's too fast, and you can't pause there because there's it's threat bias. Now we've changed a lot of things already. We've changed the threat bias to positivity bias. We've regulated the emotion so you're not walking into situations all stressed out. And then now we have the autopilot reset. By the time you do all of that, you're in a much better place. But I still wouldn't rely on actively pausing because stuff is coming in. The other thing that's huge with this that I don't want to lose sight of is when this is coming through. Remember, this happens in a quarter of a second, and this happens in a quarter of a second, and then it starts passing off to the conscious mind. And the reason why I'm going to change the slide to show the transition is because the conscious mind is not fully on board yet. And if this is processing 11 million bits per second, and this is only processing, the conscious mind is only processing at 50 bits per second, it's just now coming online. It needs time to assimilate what's happening. But the reason this is so powerful is because this was all rushed through path of least resistance, cognitive biases, threat detection. All of this was what was done before, path of least resistance, habits. And so you likely have a suboptimal recommendation. By having the network of neurons go back through and come up with, let's define what we saw, let's come up with a couple of options to recommend, and let's make a recommendation. It's like revisiting this. So you're going to pull out some of the cognitive bias stuff, you're going to pull out some of the threat based stuff, and then you're handing off a better recommended solution to the conscious mind. So this is why we do it in a workshop, because in the workshop we cover the content, the base content, and then you have the breakout groups and you have people working on a real thing, and people can chime in and talk about what they're working on, and it makes it live because you're talking about things that are real. But I want people to experience this, and they'll actually build a an autopilot upgrade during the workshop. This is in the habit mastery, or this comes in on the uh, state mastery side. We get into the state mastery because we want to have good actions coming out of there. But I'll leave it there because I could go on this for forever. We'll be on tomorrow, and tomorrow I'll move deeper into the response side, because after we have clearly defined problem and what are some possible solutions, then we have to take action on it, and that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. Is how do we know what to do? Of course, we have principles. I have hundreds of infographics that I've been collecting. I actually turn them into a video, and they're on my website, 7stepreset.com/live. You just look down on the left side. There's a video, and you could watch the infographics with a 1 or 2 second pause as they go through, so you can kind of scan it. And if there's one you want, you can just pause it, take a screenshot of that. These infographics are great because it gives you a starting point. But again, you can get overwhelmed, and you don't need 50 great solutions. You just need 2 or 3 solutions that work, and apply them, and you'll get better and better. You'll bring more in. And Good to Great, he talks about the hedgehog concept. Keep it simple. That's in Good to Great. And then in Great by Choice, he calls it simple, methodical, and consistent. So we don't want tons of stuff that has variability. We want to be simple, consistent, and do it over and over. All right, we'll see you tomorrow.